stop Exeter.
Welcome to Next Stop Exeter. Joining me today here in our studios at Exeter High School is local legend Norman Phillips. Norm, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
I've known Norm for several years, and he lived in Exeter up until just recently before relocating to Stratham. And Norm's life story is very compelling, and he was kind enough to join us here in studio to share his story with us. So, Norm, you were born and raised in Massachusetts?
Yes, yeah.
And you entered the military back in the early 40s, correct?
Yes. When World War II came up, I was swept in along with 10 million other young Americans.
And you joined the Army Air Corps?
Air Corps, yeah.
Correct. So that was a choice. You got drafted and you were able to select?
Oh, no, I wasn't drafted. Right after Pearl Harbor, in fact, in January, I went up to Montreal to try to get into the RAF, but they sent me back because we were at war, so I applied to the Army Air Corps, and they took the test, and they allowed me in.
So you were interested in joining the Royal Air Force at one point in time?
Yeah, I thought, I've never flown an airplane, but a friend of mine had just gotten through pilot school, and he inspired me to try to become a pilot. I did.
I see. So you joined the Army Air Corps. Mm-hmm. Where did they send you?
For training?
Yes.
Well, where shall I start? If you want the whole story, we went to Nashville for classification, and in Nashville they decided through a series of psychological tests and whatnot, mechanical tests, whether you should be a bombardier, a navigator, or a pilot. And then after a month there, we pilots were sent to Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama, the cradle of the Confederacy, I learned. And that was pre-flight for 2 months. After that, I went to primary, where I flew my first airplane in Helena, Arkansas for 2 months, followed by Newport, Arkansas for basic, and then Craig Field in Alabama for advanced. And then I went to Fort Myers in Florida for 2 months of combat training in the P-47. We got 72 hours in the mighty Jug, and off I went to Italy.
So you spent literally less than 2 work weeks in an airplane before you actually got shipped overseas?
Oh, no, no, no. Primary, basic, and advanced, plus the 72 hours in the P-47, I had roughly 270 hours.
So you had 270 hours in the air?
In the air,
okay.
Yes.
All right. That's how many hours I get driving my car to work in like 6 months, okay? So that's why I say that. So a born and bred Yankee gets shipped off and spends a long time down south. That must have been a fairly big cultural change for you.
It was. I often recount this story, if I may. I had seen blacks, of course, in Massachusetts and New York, but I had never witnessed the deep discrimination that went on in the South at that time. But one Sunday, while at Maxwell, on a hot afternoon, I went downtown and I went to a drugstore to get an ice cream cone, walked up to the counter, and the I guess the pharmacist in a white coat, and there were 3 little black kids there waiting. And when I came in, he looked at me, he said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Take care of them first." He says, "No, you're first." And the kid stepped aside, and I could feel what was going on. And I wasn't comfortable with that feeling. But that's the way it was.
So you leave the South, you go overseas. What country did you get shipped to?
Well, we spent 23 days in a Liberty ship, docked in Oran, Algeria, for about 2 or 3 days, and then we jumped on another ship and ended up in Naples, Italy. And my flying group was located about 15 miles north of Naples. And it was, Rome had not yet been captured,
Liberated,
but
yep.
roughly 3 weeks later, we captured Rome, and we were moved right up to Ciampino, the big air base outside of Rome.
So you get to spend some considerable time in Italy then.
Well, things move fast. By August 1st, we were shipped across the ocean to Corsica on an air base there, and from there we did all our bombing and strafing in Italy and also in southern France, getting ready for the southern France invasion. And the southern France invasion was very early September or the latter part of August. And
Of 1944?
yeah,
Okay.
and after it was invaded, 10 days later, we were at an air base in southern France. And then we continued following the army because our job was close support for ground troops.
Okay.
Up the Rhone Valley, around Switzerland, and then eventually, April 1st, my fighter group crossed the Rhine River, and we were based in Germany shortly before the war ended.
So with all the travel that you did in Italy, in France, in Germany, is there a particular place in those countries that struck you as being a place that, boy, I would have never been here because of if it hadn't been for the war, but now that I've seen this place, I'd love to come back?
Well, back in those days, believe me, you don't think about those things. It's only later, after you come home and you're married and you have kids, that you think about the grandeurs of Rome and what Florence is all about with all the art and everything else. And I have gone back and visited those places. But during the war, your dreams or wishes don't go too far into the future. You have a tendency to just think about what you're doing today and getting a good night's sleep and doing what you did today again tomorrow.
Sure. So while you were over there, in the position that you were in, was there much discussion about targets that were off limits to you? You know, specifically whether they're cultural or anything along the line?
You're bringing up something that is talked about a lot in this generation.
Correct.
At that time, I can remember when we were bombing and strafing in Italy. I remember that the Ponte Vecchio bridge going into Florence was off limits. Rome was off limits. We never dive bombed or strafed anything in either of those two places. We were cautioned about the civilian population in Italy, even though at the time they were ostensibly still with the Germans. But we as pilots learned that if you got shot down, the local populace were very friendly, and they usually sneaked us back across the lines, back to our side. So they were not enemies. Once we got into Germany, things were different. Even in France, things were a little different. I always tell people, now it seems brutal and awful, but I tell people I shot anything that moved, and that's the nature of the game.
Now, while you were serving in Europe, was there ever a point in time where you thought your plane might crash?
Oh, no. I mean, well, what you should read this book because it gives quite a detailed account of my combat experience, and in it I write about the memory of the first time I saw flak. And it's funny, at that age, at that time, I actually looked forward to getting shot at the first time. When I first saw those great big puffs of 88s bursting, I felt good and exhilarated. And later on, of course, you saw them as a threat when they occasionally hit somebody.
Gotcha.
And your attitude, that romantic attitude, changed.
So 1945, you're in Germany.
Yep.
You saw the war was coming to a close
Oh, yes.
fairly quickly.
Yeah.
What happens next? Do you get shipped immediately back to the States? Do you spend more time in Europe?
Well, I was flying on the day the war ended. I might say something about that. I was circling in Salzburg, the entry road to Hitler's Eagle's Nest. At the base of that road was a battalion of SS troopers who were the last holdouts. All the maps had lines of where the enemy forces were. And we were about to roll over and dive bomb them, and they called the radio and said it's over. So we didn't drop the bombs. We dropped the bombs in Lake Constance, not armed, and then barrel rolled and buzzed all the way home and got drunk that night.
So you get drunk that night. You wake up the next morning. Are you thinking, what now? Or
Yeah,
did you have a
what
pretty
now?
good idea what was going
now?
to happen next?
Some people were anxious to go home. I wasn't. I had no plans for myself. I didn't have college on my mind, and so I volunteered for the occupation. So I stayed there for 2 more years.
So that's an interesting point. You didn't have college on your mind, so you went from high school
Yes.
directly to piloting a
Yeah.
Thunderbolt?
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine in today's day and age someone being able to do that, right? They're looking for people who have college educations to be pilots in the military.
But I think let's say any sort of average 18-year-old that's never flown an airplane nor driven a car, you could put him in the seat or the cockpit for a few hours. That'd get it.
Sure. So the war ends. You're not sure what you're going to do with yourself. What happens?
Well, I stayed in the Air
Yep.
Force. I liked it. Next thing you know, I was married and had kids, and I stayed because I thoroughly enjoyed flying. The first time I flew, it was like getting hooked because I had this burst of exhilaration and enjoyment, and I enjoyed the flying. And so I stayed in, and I kept flying fighters for 26 years.
So peacetime comes. 5 years later, there's some rumblings on the horizon about some big doings going on in Korea.
At that time, I was
Yep.
teaching instrument flying at the Air Force Instructor Pilots Instrument School. And at that time, the Air Defense Command was on the rise because the Cold War, there was a threat of the Russian bombers coming. So the pilots we were training were largely Air Defense Command pilots. And I could have volunteered to go to Korea, but I didn't. I had 3 kids at that time, and so.
So you train other pilots
Yep.
to serve in Korea. That's
Or in Air Defense Command.
in Air
the
Defense
States,
Command.
yeah.
Where did that training take place? It was like in Colorado? Or?
No. It was at Valdosta, Georgia, Moody Air Force Base.
So back south again.
Back south.
What is it with the Air Force? They like to do everything down
Well,
south?
the weather's good there.
Sure.
Flying's about good weather.
Yep.
So,
So the Korean War ends.
yep.
You have all these pilots now that are looking to find jobs outside the Air Force.
Well, within the Air Force itself, you've got to think of the Air Force, particularly pilots. It's sort of a fraternity. And in '54, I left Moody and I went to Germany to join an F-86 fighter group that was perched on
the doorstep.
On the doorstep of the Cold War.
Yep.
Where we stood alert, 5-minute alert every day, 7 days a week. And so that's what we did. That people like in my squadron that I should mention. I had a very wonderful squadron, and Ed White, one of the early astronauts that was killed, was in my squadron. Buzz Aldrin was a flight commander in the squadron. Pete Peterson, who later spent 6 years at the Hanoi Hilton and became a congressman, and then was the first ambassador to North Vietnam. He was my adjutant. And my operations officer, James Salter, became a world-famous author. He was my ops author. So we had some pretty extraordinary people in this small group.
So there was a commercial airline industry that didn't quite exist yet in World War II. Certainly in the 50s, it was probably growing in leaps and bounds.
You're right. A lot of pilots filtered into the airline industry. Yes.
So, family man, 3 kids. What kept you from jumping into that industry?
I had
no flack either.
No. I never wanted to fly a multi-engine airplane or an airplane that had more than one crew member in it, me. And so I stuck with fighters. And I worked hard to make sure that my assignments were to fighter units.
So after the Korean War, you'd have already had spent 10 years in the military. Plenty of opportunity outside of the military, I'm sure, for an enterprising individual who loves to fly with just one engine, yet you stuck around.
Yeah.
So the Vietnam War comes up on the horizon.
Yeah. Oh,
were you interested in sitting behind a desk somewhere in the States?
No, I had spent 4 years in the Pentagon, and after the Pentagon, I was able to almost choose my assignment, and I chose going back to Germany again. I ended up at a base 10 miles from Bitburg, where I was the first time. I was at Spangdahlem, where they had the F-105. So I checked out in the F-105, and I flew that for 3 years. And then I was assigned to McConnell Air Force Base at Wichita, Kansas, where we were training F-105 pilots.
So for those not familiar, the F-105 is a fighter plane?
Oh, yes. They call it the Thud. It's a Mach 2.1 airplane, and it was a very much used airplane.
With its primary role being what?
Close support, dropping bombs.
So like 2 bombs, 4 bombs, 1 bomb?
Well, usually 6.
6, okay.
Yeah. In World War II, we carried 2 1,000-pounders. The bombs in Southeast Asia were 750-pounders, and we used to carry 6. Because we'd have wing tanks, and we'd had 6 on a centerline rack.
So you're fighting in Vietnam. Are you flying out of Vietnam? Are you flying
no, we were in Thailand. There were two 105 units over there in Thailand. One was at Tak Ly, one was at Korat, not that that matters. But those 2 units had a really high casualty rate. In 9 months' time, those 2 wings that each carries about 75 airplanes, in 9 months' time they lost over 100 airplanes. And that's all listed by airplane number in a book called Rolling Thunder.
So did you lose an airplane while you were over there?
Did I?
Yes.
Well, I got shot down.
You got shot down?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Oh, it's kind of a funny story in a way.
I love funny stories that involve planes being shot down.
I was vice commander of this wing, and I was a full colonel. And so about a week before, we have a base newspaper that comes out every day. And there's a little corner of it that's called the Commander's Corner. So I wrote the Commander's Corner's comments for Memorial Day, and they were very much, honoring the bravery and the loss of everybody. And then I went about my business, and the weeks passed. And so happens on 30th of May of 1968, I was flying, and it just happened that that was the 100th anniversary of Memorial Day, because Memorial Day, I think, was first created in 1668 after the Civil War. So this was 1968.
Yep.
And coming back from a mission in North Vietnam, we were crossing Laos, and the air command post, there's a big transport airplane loaded with people with radar screens and radios that takes care of what's going on. They called and said, anybody with a little fuel, there's a truck we've got spotted. So myself and another guy in this formation of 12 peeled off, and we found the truck, and the other pilot hit it, and it was burning, and I said, well, I'll hose the sides of the road in case the crew jumped out. And I'm in a nice hard turn looking at that target and not taking evasive action because it's been very quiet there. Just the rolling green landscape of the Laotian jungle, and all of a sudden, brrr, a handful of like Roman candle like that, boom! Red lights come on, and I was on fire. And so I pulled up, and the airplane went out of control finally, and I bailed out. And then, of course, I went crashing through the trees, and really that's when you might say, I'm not saying it in jest, but the fun began, because the system there, I hope I don't bore you with all these details, but it's not haphazard. The Air Force has a really tight, highly developed, controlled, and disciplined rescue system. The minute a pilot bails out and uses his chute, an automatic beeper sounds that alerts everybody that somebody's been shot down. Also, your wingman is honor bound to circle you until his fuel runs out, and he's radioing everybody, and there are people standing on immediate alert on the Thai-Laotian border, not only helicopters to pick you up, but also strike airplanes to hold down any. So all this system got rolling into effect. So eventually the chopper gets over me, and I see through the jungle, I can see the guy coming down in the cable, and then he disappears in the undergrowth about, well, let's say 15 or 20 yards away. And I'm yelling at him, but with the noise of the chopper and all the branches going, it's like screaming in a hurricane. You can't be heard. And I looked to the left, and I saw him, this camouflage-clad guy with makeup on his face and an AK-47 walking up there. And then he came on this side. I said, boy, he's making a circular pattern right around me. That's what they do. He's going to get back that cable and leave. So I had a 38, so I pulled my 38 out, and I fired 2 rounds across the nose of the chopper. And a pilot's rescue firearm, the first 2 rounds are tracer rounds for signaling. So they work. Well, the chopper pilot sees the traces, he thinks it's enemy, and he roared off with 125 feet of cable dangling, which promptly snagged in the trees, snarled around his wheels, and his hoist system was out. So the gunship had to come down and replace him. They put the cable down, but they weren't a rescue chopper, so they put down too much cable. And of course, when the chopper left, I was able to yell at the young airman, and he came to me and he started to take care of me. And he was putting me on the penetrator, and the big loop of cable started to close. I said, look out, they're putting, caught him by the ankle, and up he went through the trees, dangling by one ankle.
Upside down?
Upside down. So we both he was screaming on his radio because he had a radio on a lanyard tied to his wrist, and I rolled over on mine, and my arm was broken, and I couldn't squeeze the trigger, but I pressed it between my knees like that, and I said, "You got your airman by the leg, let him down." They started him down, and he fell out the last 20 feet or so. So he cracked his arm, and his leg was cut, but he got to me, put me on the penetrator, and they pulled us up, and it was a gunship, so it was amazingly funny to see these two miniguns. Miniguns fire 6,000 rounds a minute of 22 caliber. So there's a stream of traces. It was like a shower of fire coming down. And up we went into that, and
off you went.
That was it. And that young man is cited in this book. He's a pararescue man. He was the third living enlisted man to get the Air Force Cross for my rescue. And he also got the Cheney Award. That's not for Dick Cheney, that somebody precedes him. That's a one-time year award for heroism on behalf of another human. So Tom Newman is the guy that rescued me.
So do you have a little time to join us for part 2 of our episode here?
Sure.
I'd love to hear more. I know you have a lot more to share with us.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us here for part 1 of our series here leading up to our Memorial Day special. And once again, Norman Phillips, thanks again. Norm, welcome back to our show.
Thank you.
When we last spoke, you were sharing with us being extracted from the jungle in Vietnam. What happens next? You're being pulled into a helicopter.
Oh, yeah. Well, I decided I retired from the Air Force then. I didn't have to, but I decided to.
So halfway up into the helicopter, you decided, this is it, I'm done.
Well, no, I sort of had my mind made up. When I went to Thailand, I had a feeling it was the wrong war. I was in the Pentagon before for 4 years, and by the time I made full colonel, I began to see with more depth what was going on, and I didn't like it. And as Bob McNamara finally admitted, it was a big mistake going to, and I kind of knew that before it all came. I knew, or I felt, that Ho Chi Minh was not a threat to the USA. He didn't have a navy or anything, and he asked the U.S. for help, and I think the U.S. government turned him down because France, his colonial masters, were our allies. So we stuck with France, and of course, France lost his butt in Dien Bien Phu, and then we followed them in the same kind of a feudal gesture.
I see. So you brought with you a bag with something that was special to you in it. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, I think this is kind of interesting. This, if you can see it or not, this rather pinkish fabric is part of a monk's robe, and the wire with the little pieces of stone and brass and whatnot were a necklace worn by a young Thai man who was mandatorily had to spend a year as a monk, and he wore that as a monk. And he worked in our personal equipment area where he helped pilots on with their heavy parachutes and everything. And he had wrapped this necklace up in this piece of monk's cloth, and he had it wrapped with string, and he put it in my flight suit over my heart, and he said, if you wear this, you will be able to see the end of the war. And our losses were very high, so I didn't think much of it then. In fact, not until I got home, probably at least a year later after I got home, I opened up my flight suit and unzipped it and unraveled that, and the little necklace began to have some meaning for me, so I framed it and I hung it on the wall with all my I Love Me photographs.
I see. So this is kind of the centerpiece of your
Yes.
wall of fame.
Yeah.
But it's my understanding that your wall of fame contains far more than just you piloting fighter planes. I understand you've done a number of things in your life
Oh, yes.
that viewers of our show might find interesting. Can you share
well,
some of those with us?
Yeah, this book, the other thing I should mention, I don't want people to think that everything I did was heroic. In writing this book at my advanced age, I realized that why I did all the things that I did was because I never grew up. I'm still 18 years old between the ears. And so while in Europe, while I was flying fighters, I climbed just about every major peak in Europe. I climbed the Matterhorn, Mont Blanc, Zenal Rothorn, the Zugspitze, and several others. I was about the 300th person in the U.S. to take up sport parachute jumping. Then I went through Army jump school, and then I ejected. So I'm probably one of few people that have jumped all three different ways. And why did I do that? Just because that 18-year-old urge hit me. To me, it was nothing more than going to an amusement park and riding a big roller coaster. So, and another little episode, there's a saying for the military that you shouldn't volunteer, but I volunteered for everything. And I volunteered once to fly a jet off a narrow Mexican highway and fly it back to the States. But that's the way my life went.
How did that jet get on the Mexican
Oh,
highway?
a young lieutenant got hypoxic, and he got lost, and he strayed to the city of Navajoa, roughly 250 miles south of El Paso. He landed on a small gravel field, and the jet doesn't accelerate in hot weather. It's about 105 degrees there. So I had the jet towed out with a farm truck out to a narrow asphalt highway, and they lined it with 300 members of the Mexican army, and off I went.
Were they all waving to you as you took off?
Well, half the town followed us out because they had never seen a jet before. So anyway.
So how did your name get drawn out of a hat to be the guy that got to take a jet off from a highway?
No. The group commander at an officer's call asked, anybody want to go to Mexico? I'm one of those guys. I raised my hand. I'll go. It sounded interesting.
I assume that the officer that asked that probably already figured that you were going to volunteer for this, right?
No, I don't know that he would, because he had probably 125 officers there. Mm-hmm. I don't know that I wouldn't necessarily say that. I just did it because I'm who I am, and it's only lately that I've figured out, I think, who I really am.
And what is that? What do you really are now?
Well, as I tell everybody about World War II, that applies to World War II too. Everyone just thank you for your service. I'm saying that a typical, average American young man who's physically fit, put in the same situations I did, would do the same thing I did. So there's nothing unusual about it. It's just that I never grew up and got careful. I was careful because I never did anything foolish. I did reckless things, but I knew what I was doing.
So if today we were to jump in a car and drive to Pease Air Force
My
Base.
wife doesn't let me drive because I still drive too fast. 90 is still kind of a brisk pace.
All right. So, all right, let's say we walk to the Pease Air Force Base, and there's an F-15 parked on the tarmac.
Yeah.
If someone gave you a 15-minute over-the-shoulder tutorial.
Oh, I could fly it, but I wouldn't. At age 80, I skied avidly, and I hadn't fallen down for about 2 years. But at age 80, I gave my skis and boots away because there's a time to come and a time to go. And I recognize I'm old. I can't do the things now that I did then. I have no sadness about it either. I did it, and I smile about the past, and I don't worry about it. I think about it pleasantly.
So that was at age 80. I can't imagine that for the last 13 years you've been sitting around doing nothing. What have you been doing for the last 13 years? Writing, okay.
I started writing. I'm on really the first book is too small, so this is really the second published. But I'm on my third book. I'm about 80% into it.
And have you sold a lot of books?
Well, keep in mind,
a lot for me would be more than five. All right, so
this
is five.
This is self-published. It costs money to publish these days if you're an unknown author, and I think I'm just about even. But if anybody wants a copy, it's available on Amazon and from Trafford Publishing, or you can get it from me, and I'll sign it for $20.
Now, I have to say, someone that has been around as long as you have, the computer might seem a little bit overwhelming. But not only do you use a computer, you're actually self-publishing.
Oh, yes.
So if you're not afraid to self-publish, what's next on your list to do?
Well, just more writing. It's physically, one age. I'm going to be 94 this year. You slow down. I still go to the gym 5 days a week, and I find that thoughtful things, I find those very stimulating. And I'm bored with bar talk that's pointless. I like to engage people in intellectual is sort of a snotty word, but conversations that go a little beyond what the baseball team scores are and things like that.
Well, that's good. I was afraid you were going to have me be in a push-up contest with you.
No,
you do the gym
no,
5 days a week.
No.
I see.
No.
Wow. Well, that's great. It sounds like you're making the most of your time. You're an inspiration to people all over. I've had friends that have mentioned you in passing. Hey, who's the guy on the treadmill over there? And I said, go ask him. He'll tell you exactly who he is. And
well, should I mention that a couple of people are making a movie about me?
A movie?
Yeah.
So a TV show on Exeter isn't enough? You got to have a movie too?
No, this is a long...
Okay.
They've filmed about 38 hours with a couple of professional photographers and followed me to Las Vegas to my fighter squadron reunion, to New York when I was involved in the art scene, and even my hometown, and even to the Quabbin where I worked when I was 16 years old. And they've got it honed down to 2.5 hours now. Dr. Bob Baer and Jay McNamee are doing this.
So if there's a trailer for this movie, can we show a trailer release on our show? We did that in our last 2 episodes ago. We did a trailer release for the new Market Basket movie coming out, so we could become the go-to place for movie trailers.
Well,
Well, Norm, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It was a great honor, a great privilege to have you part of Next Stop Exeter, and we look forward to seeing your movie. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.